the southern tip of the United States and north of the Republic of Cuba lie the 6,000 islands of the Bahamas. A few of these islands are well known, but the other thousands are seldom visited. Many of them are uninhabited. Fringing these islands are thousands of miles of coral reef spread out in ragged patterns just below the water surface, forming a unique undersea world, a world underwater about which even today very little is known. Occasionally, an adventurous boatman threading his way through these remote islands will be startled to see two small boats apparently abandoned and adrift on the open sea. But if he could look down under those boats, he'd see two divers working entirely on their own, Mr. and Mrs. Muller, Constance and Wesley, who are very much at home in this rendezvous in the reef. What they do down here is the story they're going to tell you. When they're not exploring at the bottom of the sea, you'll usually find them aboard their boat, the Luray. So let's go aboard and meet Connie and Wes Muller.
These islands really do seem remote to us, even though we're only a few hundred miles from the Florida coast. But alone in these islands, Connie and I feel more at home than anywhere else. I suppose it's because we're doing a kind of work we really like to do. You see, up until a few years ago, Connie and I, like many other couples, commuted every day to our jobs in the big city. It wasn't that we disliked our jobs. As a matter of fact, we really enjoyed our work. But we'd had enough of crowds and commuting. Most of all, we wanted to find something we could work at together.
Both Wes and I have always loved the sea. We decided to become seagoing photographers. So we got this boat. An old-timer and a little bit slow, maybe, but seaworthy and comfortable. She's been our only home for a long time now.
We quit our jobs, borrowed a camera, and headed south. We had decided to concentrate on a field that was definitely not overcrowded. Pictures made under the sea.
If we had known what we were getting into, well, I'm not sure we would have tried it.
Halfway down the east coast of Florida, we put into the snug little harbor of Ogallie. Here the Luray was fitted out. There were both smiles and head waggings as the untried adventurers got underway. Months of tiresome preparation were suddenly behind us, and on the open sea, life took on new color. Several miles from the Florida coast, we passed Fowey Rock's Light, the last reminder of home. We set our course for Nassau. Again and again, we measured and figured our position. The waves became steep-sided, but the Luray, even with her heavy load, behaved beautifully. We were tired, but elated when finally we were near enough to see Nassau Lighthouse and the harbor entrance. At Nassau, our ship was officially registered and issued her cruising transire to cruise the out islands. As we were looking for undisturbed coral reef, we had to leave the beaten track, and charts often have little or no detail over those areas unsuited for navigation. So if we insist on taking our boat into coral reef, we find that area on the chart simply marked foul ground. However, in the Bahamas, the water is clear as crystal. So clear that with the sun behind us, we could pick our way through unfamiliar channels with only an occasional use of the sounding lead to measure the water's depth. The coral reef, which is just below the surface, shows up as purplish streaks, which can be detected hundreds of yards ahead. Many good harbors have entrances protected by these reefs, and it is at this point that the pilot is really put to the test. Once we have entered the fast-flowing tide of these narrow channels, the slightest miscalculation or uncertainty would court disaster. outside the harbor, the water deepens to a level sand bottom where we drop both of our bow anchors, one upstream and the other downstream, to form a safe mooring for the Luray. That put us right about here in the island chain called the Exumas. We didn't know it then, but we were to return to these islands year after year. We'd spend months at a time without seeing another human being. Lonesome? Not at all. We were far too busy.
We will confess that as divers and photographers, we were at first the rankest sort of amateurs. I guess we made every mistake possible and had a few close calls in the bargain. So there were times when our spirits were very, very low.
But we stayed with it. After all, we had no alternative. After months of trial and error, we had improved our equipment and developed a technique which began to show results. And now we'd like very much to take you along on a typical dive. The reef we are headed for extends several miles out from the shoreline. The only safe way to enter this reef is with small boats. This little compressor, with its gasoline engine, is perhaps our most important piece of equipment, for it must pump air steadily when we go beneath the surface. When preparing to dive, we put on weighted rubber boots. On the bottom, they don't keep out water, but they do protect from scratches and cuts and the poisonous coral. Large fish will occasionally attack a light-colored object in the water, so dark, heavy clothing is worn. We towed the heavily loaded diving boat out to the distant reef. As Connie checks over the ocean floor through a glass-bottom bucket, I get the gas-driven air compressor hooked up. We certainly pampered that compressor, and with good reason. When we were both working down on the bottom, that compressor just had to run steadily, for hours at a time, for there was no one above water to tend it. A weighted chain is our stairway to the bottom. A short ladder fixed to the stern gives us a foothold for getting in and out of the diving helmet. Being a gentleman, I always let my wife go down first. The heavy cast iron helmet has to be lowered gently onto the diver's shoulders. As you probably know, our diving helmet works just like this glass. When immersed in the water, it traps a bubble of air. The diver can breathe naturally with his head in this air bubble, and he can see through the transparent sides. An air hose constantly replenishes the air in the helmet, forcing the stale air out around the diver's shoulders. I keep a careful check on Connie's progress through the water glass. This simple device allows us to keep track of each other. When Connie is set, I send down the camera equipment, a 16-millimeter motion picture camera mounted in a waterproof bronze box with a plate glass window. Many times we've been asked, who does the photography when we are both in the picture? That's easy. The camera is rigged with our special remote control device so that we can start it whenever we are ready to take a scene. When the equipment has been sent down, I leave the compressor and the boats to themselves and climb down the chain feeling very much like a swinging piece of bait. We have now stepped out of our own familiar world. Our only trace, these two small boats swinging at anchor and a thin line of bubbles. We can stay down only as long as our faithful compressor keeps pumping. Every time we go below, we experience a feeling of stepping through Alice's looking glass into an exciting, topsy-turvy wonderland. Instead of birds and flowers, we see fish of all colors and shapes. We see fantastic growths and plant-like formations that are not plants at all, but belong to the animal kingdom. Speech is impossible, for we are almost deafened by the steady roar of air in our helmets. We feel a peculiar lightness, but if we try to move quickly, we are held back as though in a dream. We know we're immersed in water, but strangely enough, we don't even feel damp. Colors take on a soft pastel hue, which at a distance of 100 feet or so, blend away into a solid curtain of blue-green. At first, we even found it difficult to judge distance. The water is so clear that its movement is no more visible than that of the air up in our own world. Unless we are warned by the waving of sea fronds, we could step carelessly into a swift-flowing current which would knock us flat, and we'd have to crawl to hold our own against the relentless thrust of the water. While we were acquiring our undersea legs, we began making photographs of the coral formations. Each formation is constantly being built by myriads of tiny animals. Each one deposits a hard material, always following definite patterns which vary according to the species. Over centuries of time, these tiny creatures add to the formation inch by inch until the extensive coral reefs are formed. On the surface of the coral heads, we sometimes found small growths of various shapes and colors which didn't seem to fit into these patterns. When we touched them, we found they were not part of the coral at all, but lively little animals called plume worms that withdrew so suddenly they startled us. As we gained confidence, we began climbing up on the reef. Extreme care was needed since these coral heads have a nasty trick of breaking off without warning. One day, standing high up on a reef, I suddenly saw a large shark coming right toward me. That signal means, drop everything, come quick. Connie abandons her equipment and runs as fast as it is possible for a diver to move. It's a lemon shark, and a big one too. Fortunately, this shark takes no notice of us. He seems intent on tracking down some particularly exciting odor in the reef. Two shark suckers ride along with him, one alongside his dorsal fin, while on the opposite side, the other is clinging to his tail. When the shark left, we found ourselves on a precarious ledge with our hoses thoroughly entangled in spite of our care. We experienced moments of panic as we cleared our lines and made our way back to a safer footing. Just as I thought I was clear of the reef, I felt a violent pull, and turning around, found I had to make my tedious way back again to untangle my hose. We quickly learned to detect the approach of large fish by observing the action of small ones around us. Skipjacks, some larger creature, often a stingray. These weird creatures are able to rest on the bottom covered with sand, practically invisible. If stepped on, they will inflict a painful injury. We've been able to get some good pictures, apparently because the fish accepted us as harmless intruders. However, we wanted to become better acquainted with these reef dwellers so that we could study and photograph them more closely. Obviously, the best way would be to invite them to dinner. But since we were quite edible ourselves, we were not too keen about appealing to the appetites of the more voracious fish, particularly the barracuda. One morning, as an experiment, we tossed a piece of conch to a barracuda. He snapped it up and then just as quickly spit it out again. Here, apparently, was a somewhat selective food lure, one we could use safely in our efforts to get on a more friendly basis with the reef fish. With Connie acting as spotter, it was no trick to gather a good supply. Conch is a mollusk related to our friend the oyster. It is consumed in tremendous quantities by the people who live in these islands. When captured, the animal quickly withdraws well up inside his heavy shell. When the top of the shell is broken, the conch can be pulled out. The meat is white, fine in texture, and has a flavor very much like fresh scallops. It can be made into a wide variety of delicious dishes, and, of course, it makes excellent bait for fishing. In one of our favorite diving spots, we began to float bits of conch toward a group of reef fish. The smaller fish lost their timidity almost immediately, but it seemed that the larger the fish, the longer it would take to overcome his suspicion. One of the Nassau groupers was especially curious. He had a buddy, the rockfish. They palled around together, and whenever we saw one, we usually saw the other. After many visits, we finally coaxed these two fish to accept food directly from our hands. From this point on, our friendship grew rapidly. Whenever our boat entered the reef, these two fish would be waiting for us. The grouper became a real prima donna. He grew jealous whenever we stroked or fed other fish. Like a pet dog, he seemed to enjoy our caresses. He became a very adept scene stealer. If he felt he was being slighted, he had other ways of getting attention. One of these was to catch the diver off guard and playfully send him sprawling. We learned to use two hands to caress our underwater friends, for the pressure of just one hand would only serve to push them away. One day, a baby nurse shark joined our group. At first, just like a new boy in the neighborhood, the newcomer was not very popular. However, he was big enough to hold his own and was finally accepted. Whenever we wanted to shift our location, all we had to do was pick up the anchor and just walk away. The two boats floating overhead followed along, bringing the steadily working air compressor. We often wondered what the occasional passing boatman must have thought of this strange apparition. On days when our work is going well, we may remain on the bottom as much as 6 hours. However, one of us must return to the surface in the midst of the dive to refuel the air compressor. While we're on the bottom, we never seem to feel tired. But when the diver emerges, he is suddenly aware of fatigue as well as every scratch or other minor injury. However, there is compensation in the delicious tang of the fresh air. in wonderful contrast to hours of oily compressed air, well flavored with rubber hose. The quick check on the weather becomes automatic. Spilled gas must be avoided, for the compressor would pump the fumes down to the diver. Year after year, we have made improvements in our diving rig. The rack in the back of the dinghy makes each diver completely independent. Even so, we must take care to avoid injury when putting on the clumsy 60-pound helmet. Everything carefully checked, I joined Connie, who is waiting for me on the bottom with our newest specimen. The spiny lobster is seldom seen abroad in the daytime. Normally, this species sleeps in great piles far under the ledges of the reef, emerging at dusk to seek out food by odor or taste. We crawled under a ledge and poked this spiny lobster awake and then waved a chunk of conch in front of his tentacles. And after days of very patient work, he learned to come toward the sound of the diver's bubbles and beg for food. As we made more and more friends on the seafloor, our grouper became increasingly jealous. If either of us paid too much attention to the lobster, the grouper would show his annoyance by changing color and he would swim over toward the other diver. Nor was he always polite to our new guest. The spiny lobster proved extremely friendly. Despite his formidable armament, he never attempted to harm us, either with his pincers or with the knives on the sides of his tail. After much association with creatures on the bottom, we would find ourselves unconsciously imitating them. Connie caught me one day following the lobster by walking on my hands around the corner of the reef. The moray eel is the rattlesnake of the sea. Lurking in the reef, he's tough, savage, and voracious. But even he proved responsive to patient coaxing. By offering him conch, we lured him out into the open, where he sniffed about, looking for the source of that delicious odor. As the spiny lobster receives food, the moray attacks from the rear, but the lobster retreats with the food supply caged inside his armor-plated legs. Defeated in this attempt, the moray accepts food from our hands, then tries to break it to bite size by dashing it against the bottom. After that, even the barracuda, tiger of the sea, held no fears for us. This one, which we could always recognize by the spot on his mouth, became one of our regular friends. Since the barracuda wouldn't eat conch, and we didn't care to sacrifice any of our fish friends, we hit upon the idea of feeding him sardines, fresh out of the can. Have you ever tried to open a slippery can of sardines underwater? With the barracuda watching, we had to keep our hands covered. We didn't dare take off the black gloves, which were certainly no help in turning the little wire key. The oil floating up out of the can instantly gets his interest. Finally, the can, still containing a few scraps, is dropped to the bottom, and the barracuda dives in pursuit, turning nearly black with excitement. Our oddest character was the trunkfish. He had a mouth that looked so inconsequential, but looks are deceiving. Once Connie was naive enough to let him nibble her gloved finger, and he came down like a pair of pliers. The shark, unlike the barracuda, will eat conch. He feeds primarily by tracking odor rather than by sight. Our friend the lemon shark is back again. Notice the two small jacks swimming just ahead of his nose. No matter how suddenly he turns, the two little fish are always in front of him. There was always a note of ominous excitement in feeding a large shark, even though he was one of our friends. We would like to play with him just as we do the grouper, but feel that too much familiarity with a fish of this size could lead to somewhat unpleasant consequences. The smaller nurse shark is, of course, considered to be harmless, but we still took care to avoid his nibbling our fingers. The nurse shark can be distinguished from other sharks by the two projections hanging down from either side of his mouth. A bag of conch suspended from the boat was very tempting. There have been times when these friendly fish upset our work by blundering into the camera controls, setting off the exposure prematurely. Even after 10 years, in which we have spent more than 2,000 hours on the bottom of the sea, our enthusiasm for this absorbing life is as fresh as ever. We relish the discoveries and the experiences of each new day. As the colors about us begin to fade, ending underwater photography for the day, we take leave of our friends. But even as we pack up, we're making new plans. We're looking ahead to many more happy days in our rendezvous in the reef. For we know we've only begun to penetrate the mysteries of the sea.